Okay? What I'm doing now is I'm cleaning the propolis from the boxes, and in a minute I'll start with another box and I'll clean the propolis off the frames. The propolis is a substance that the bees gather from tree buds. It's a resinous substance. Cottonwood buds, for example, in the spring are very sticky. That's one of the sources of the propolis, and the bees use that to caulk up small cracks, to fill gaps between any parts in the hive that are less than a bee space. They put a fine sheen on all the internal parts, and propolis has an antibiotic property, so it's an antiseptic for the hive. I collect it and sell it to pharmaceutical companies. It's worth far more than the honey. Propolis raw like this is worth about $20 a pound. Of course, you don't get very much, but I sort of think of it as my tip for the day for cleaning up the boxes. And in a good day, I might collect $40 or $50 worth of propolis in the process of extracting.
You mentioned in an earlier tape what the pharmaceutical companies do with the propolis. Do you want to repeat that?
They'll take this and they'll dissolve it in 190 proof alcohol. It takes that strength of alcohol to dissolve it. And then they will put it through a filter press and they'll make a tincture of propolis. And they use that to make throat sprays and lozenges and preparations like that. You can find them in the health food stores, and now in some of the more ordinary stores you can find propolis preparations. When we first started to understand the properties of propolis, I had a beekeeping friend stop over who brought a beekeeper from Argentina, and we were over here extracting one evening, and Barbara was helping, and he was the beekeeper from Argentina was investigating the properties of propolis, and we were talking about it, and I knew a little bit about it, and Barbara had a little bit of a sore throat. So I got a nice clean chunk of propolis and I said, "Here, take this." Well, what I forgot to tell her was to suck on it, not chew it. Well, about 5 minutes later I looked over at Barbara and she flashed me a smile and her teeth were all brown. This propolis had coated her teeth. It took 2 or 3 days for it to wear off. Barbara's gone through a lot being married to a beekeeper, and she's been very tolerant. So this is propolis that I'm scraping from the end bars. I just set those over there temporarily to give myself a little room to work.
You have one very sluggish bee emerging from
That's a
that
drone. That's the male bee. They have a pretty good life if they're born in the early part of the summer. They just hang out, eat honey, and cruise for queens in the afternoon. Their only purpose is to be there in the event that the colony needs to produce a new queen. But the day of reckoning comes In another 2 or 3 weeks, when the nights start to cool, the colony recognizes that they don't need those drones in the winter. So the drones that are remaining in the colony will be ejected from the hive in the evening, physically dragged out, and the guard bees won't let them come back in when the temperature drops that night. Then they chill and die. So although a colony of bees is a very cooperative society, it's also very ruthless, and there's not a whole lot of sentiment involved. My hands really take a beating at harvest time. One of these supers filled, total weight is about 65 pounds. So I'm lifting constantly with my fingertips. I do a lot of prying and scraping, as you can see right now, on the frames. And my hands complain a little in the beginning. Of course, they've been getting a workout through most of the summer, but this is kind of the end of it. This is the marathon. And by the end of the harvest, I can crack walnuts with my bare hands. I'm fortunate that all the parts keep working.
Well, this is the 7th of September. When do you think you will be done with harvesting?
I pretty much have to be done by the end of the month because I rely primarily on the ambient temperature, and the honey, as it cools, gets stiff and difficult to extract, filter, pump. Ultimately, if it gets too cool, I wouldn't be able to get it out of the comb at all. The reason is I don't use any heat, and I don't use any heat because the really delicate flavors of honey are very volatile and they're easily lost. And so I'm somewhat restricted in that I can't heat everything up. Commercial operators might run into November, and they would have a hot room that they'd bring supers into where they might hold the temperature at 98 degrees. That keeps everything nice and warm and toasty. And then the honey would be heated in the extracting process, which keeps everything flowing. So they're not as restricted by the weather as I am.
As a one-man operation, how many hives can you maintain?
Well, you know, that's like asking a woman, how many children could you have? You know, for some women, one would be more than enough. And for others, a dozen isn't enough. It really depends to a great degree on the management practices. A commercial operation, generally the rule of thumb in a commercial operation, and that would be a beekeeping operation with, say, 1,000 up to 3,000 or 4,000 colonies, figures that one man can service 1,000 colonies of bees. Now the way I do it, I run between 70 and 100 colonies. At one time I was up as high as 200. Some one-man operations using some of the shortcuts that the commercial operators would use might run 200 to 400 colonies. In my case, 100 would be the maximum. It's a very intensive management process, a lot of manipulation. We talked earlier about double queening. That takes a lot of extra time and attention, and the result, though, is that my production is much higher than the average commercial colony would be. In Colorado, the average would run from, say, 50 in a bad year to maybe 80 in a good year. In some cases, a little better in certain locations. With a two-queen colony, I expect a two-queen colony to produce, on average, about 160 pounds each year. And I have them regularly hit 260. I've had them go over 300. I had one that went over 400. So that's the payback for that investment of time and labor and technique. Well, let me get 3 more frames and then we can extract the whole bunch.
Okay.
I accumulate the propolis in milk jugs because they're readily available.
Hold it, Sushi.
And in a good day of extracting, I'll be able to fill 1 milk jug. That's just under 3 pounds of propolis, and it sells for between $18 and $20 a pound. Give the knife a few seconds to warm up.
What are you going to be doing here?
This is an uncapping knife, and a large commercial operation would have an uncapping system that would do many, many combs per hour. For me, I can do about an extractor load an hour. That's 2 1/3 boxes. I think I might have mentioned yesterday or at some point that my friend Lyle Johnston down in Rocky Ford, who's probably the biggest commercial beekeeper in the state, would run about 500 supers in a good day. In a good day, I'll run 14. So there's the difference. Of course, I think my honey is much better than his, but Lyle might argue with that. Now, by putting 9 frames in a box, we cause the bees to draw the comb out beyond the plane of the wood, which is why we can uncap the comb the way we can, which is the reason we put 9 frames in a box. But it doesn't always work perfectly, so some of the comb is going to be lower than the plane of the wood, and when I pass it over the knife, I'll get some spots that don't get uncapped, and when I get to one of those, I'll show you what I do there. So there's a couple of patches that didn't get hit by the knife. I take this little gizmo, which is a capping scratcher, and just scratch those caps. No matter how fast you spin that in the extractor, if those cells are capped, that honey will not come out. That has a few cells of drone brood at the bottom, and I don't want to uncap those, so I'll just do this one by hand.
A few cells of drone brood?
Yes.
Would you explain that?
That's the brood from which the drones will emerge. Those won't. They're
How did it look different from the other?
the worker brood is flat. It's even with the face of the comb. The drone brood sticks out. There's a few cells of worker brood.
Now, would you point to them?
They are right there. Now, normally we try not to have any brood in honey supers. It's no great cause for concern as far as the honey is concerned, but we try to manipulate things so that the brood remains down below in the hive bodies, but the bees have the freedom to roam through that entire stack from top to bottom. So occasionally the queen will sneak up into the honey supers if she's a very prolific queen and there's a lot of pressure for her to get some new brood space, she may work her way up into the honey supers occasionally. Usually what I'll do is, if there's much, I'll leave it on the hives until it's hatched out, collect it at the last, or I'll bring it in and I'll pull it out and I'll put it on a couple of colonies that I have here at the honey house and let it hatch out.
So the bees will accept workers, newly hatched workers from another hive?
Well, they won't readily accept adult bees from another hive, but they'll accept brood. They make no distinction. Of course, we can trick them a little bit. We may have talked about it earlier. I use vanilla spray. Just a teaspoon of vanilla in a pint spray bottle with water. And if I have a weak colony, for example, and I want to give them some brood and bees, if they wouldn't have enough bees to cover that brood and support it, then you need to give them bees too. So I'd take a frame covered with bees, a brood frame, and I'd spray it with the vanilla spray, and then I'd spray down into the hive that's going to receive them, and that vanilla odor masks the hive odor, and by the time it's worn off, it doesn't last too long, but by the time it's worn off, they've all become acquainted and they meld with no fighting. I've always said that someday they'll find me head down in the spinner. All chopped up. Hasn't happened yet, but I guess it'd be a fitting end for a beekeeper. These cappings, what we're taking off, are called cappings, and they have a certain amount of honey that's cut off with the cappings. The machine that they're falling into is called a capping spinner. Essentially, it's like a washing machine with just a spin cycle. There's an inner basket, and the cappings are thrown to the side, and most of the honey is removed from the cappings by centrifugal force and can be recaptured without the use of any heat. Then that gets rendered, and that's used in my operation. That's used for candle making. Oh, getting ahead of myself. Extractor and start spinning out some honey. Most extractors would be similar to the capping spinner. They sit on the floor and they go round and round like this. This is called a vertical radial, or a cabinet extractor, and this one goes around like a Ferris wheel. Goes around this way. And the reason that I chose this kind, and there's only one company that makes this kind of extractor, but the reason that I chose this kind of extractor is pretty obvious. If you look around the honey house, floor space is at a premium, and this takes up much less floor space. There it comes. Now I'm going to turn on the honey pump, and since I drained the pipe, you'll be able to see the honey rise up through the pipe. I've tried all combinations of filters, and you have to stage it because the honey is cold. You can't run it through a real fine filter, initially at least. So the filters in the buffer tank will take out larger particles, then these filters will take out some of the particles, and then the cheesecloth will do the final filtering. Then I let it sit overnight. Hear it hitting the bottom? The tank is empty. I let it sit overnight to let the air rise. It forms kind of a cream at the top, and as those bubbles rise, they also will pull some of those pollen particles and wax particles up with them, and then that gets skimmed before we bottle.
Strainers you have over here, did you hear? I'm going to ask you a few strainers over here. Why do you have so many different meshes?
Well, because I do the honey cold, the filtering is a challenge. There actually is a company that sells honey on the internet called Really Raw Honey, and they would sell it just as it comes out of the extractor with chunks of wax and whatever happens to be incorporated at extracting time. That's not my preference, so I filter out the wax chunks and things like that. Because it's cold, you have to stage that. You can't initially run it through a very fine filter because the honey is very thick. It's like the oil in your engine. If I were to heat it up, then I could do that, and that's what most other beekeepers do. But I have to do it in stages, first with a coarse filter, then with a little finer filter, and then finally through the cheesecloth.
So you will eventually run this honey again through another?
No. It's going into the tank. That's the last of the filtering. There's a certain amount of fine air bubbles that are incorporated in the extracting process. I'll let that tank sit overnight. The air bubbles will rise to the top. They'll bring some of those last finest wax particles to the top, and that gets skimmed. But there will be some of those wax particles in the final product, very very fine. But
you have so many filters over there. I'm wondering why you just chose these two.
just experimentation, just trying things that worked or didn't work. If one's too fine, then it begins to back up the whole process. You know, all this has to run at pretty much the same speed. I have to be able to extract a load while the load's being spun, and I have to be able to filter what's in the buffer tank, and anything that slows that process then messes up the whole thing. Payday. Oop. Someone gets a little extra.
It must be very gratifying, this last stage of the process.
It's funny. I don't know of a beekeeper who wouldn't like to have someone else do the extracting. They'd rather just keep the bees. When it comes right down to it, they want
Feel the same way?
they want to do the extract. Well, it's very hard work, and it comes at the end of a long, hard season, and you know, it looks interesting when you look at a snapshot of it, but this is grueling work, and it goes on day after day after day. And yeah, if I had a fairy godfather who would come in and do it to my standards, I'd probably do that. You bet. But at the same time, yeah, it is very gratifying. It's a wonderful craft. There are a lot of frustrations. The American beekeeping industry is on the verge of extinction if we don't start making some changes. And but it's very gratifying. Everything we do is beneficial. And in the end, we produce one of nature's finest delicacies. So I wouldn't give it up.
We need to have something on granulation now.
Okay. The honey is liquid when I extract it, obviously, or I wouldn't be able to get it out of the comb. But it comes as a surprise to most people that the natural state of honey is not as a liquid. It's a supersaturated solution of sugars. It has more sugars than it can hold in equilibrium. And if it isn't interfered with, it will begin to granulate or crystallize. The old term is called going to sugar. There are very few floral exceptions to that. Tupelo honey is one. Sage honey is another. They take a long, long time to granulate, but most of the honeys from this area will granulate very quickly. And that means that it'll turn solid. The reason that it's liquid on the store shelves is because beekeepers discovered long ago that if they heated the honey, it made everything work more efficiently. The filtering goes more easily, the combs can be extracted more completely, and they found also that if they bottled it hot at about 140 degrees, that it would retard that natural process of granulation. The downside is that the really delicate flavors of honey are very volatile, and subjecting them to heat means that they go off into the ozone. It doesn't mean that the honey's been ruined, it just means that it's not quite as exceptional as it might be. So my honey I do cold. It granulates very quickly. In the beginning of the harvest, the granulation may be a week or two behind me. That first run may take a week, probably 2 weeks before it begins to granulate. This year it was granulating within 5 days, that first run. By the end of the harvest, by the end of September though, I'm a footstep ahead of the granulation. It's about a day behind me, and I've got to keep everything moving. I can't let it sit in any of the tanks. I can't let it sit in any of the pipes. I got to keep it moving, and it's usually a horse race right down to the end between me and the granulation. Before the discovery of the bee space by Langstroth in 1851, beekeeping was a pretty primitive craft, and the harvesting of honey was pretty hard on the bees. The bees were basically, man just provided a vessel in which the bees would do their thing, and it could be a clay tile or a hollow log, a log gum. You've probably heard that term. A straw skep. You see the straw skeps in a lot of graphics. But the harvesting consisted of going in and scooping out that comb the way you might clean out a pumpkin or a muskmelon, and then taking the result and squeezing it in some sort of fabric to strain the honey through, and then the end result was liquid honey. As a consequence, it was very hard on the bees, the production was very low, and most of the honey that was produced was reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. The average person probably rarely, if ever, tasted honey. The peasant class that kept the bees enjoyed the honey, but most people for thousands of years never had an opportunity to taste much honey. So that's the most primitive process, and I want to show you a piece of equipment that I bought at an auction a year ago that's probably from the 30s that follows that practice of squeezing the honey out of the comb. Oh boy, that's heavy. This is called a German wax press. And let me get it out here a little ways. And what it has, it's like a screw press. Okay, that's the press. And then there's an inner basket. And in the inner basket are a couple of screens, and then you can layer your honey that you've cut out of the frames or cut out of the hive, put that in there, and if you look at the bottom, it has a cone bottom with a little shed roof on the top. Now there's a hole underneath that little umbrella top. You fill it with water, you put it over a heat source. The heat source rises up, warms the honey. You put your follower in there, put your press in there, bolt it down, start screwing it down. The honey comes out through the screens and comes out this hole down here. Now, to process the wax, you just need to raise the heat above the melting temperature of the wax. So, this is the old way of doing it, the most fundamental way of doing it, and they actually made equipment to accomplish that. You're more likely to find something like this maybe in Europe. And this very well might have been made for that trade. It's called the German wax press. It could have been made for that market. I went to an auction of a beekeeping friend who was going out of business and saw it. I really don't need it, but I couldn't resist.